One day, a century ago, a father asked his daughter to do an unheard of thing. She was uncertain, worried about what people would think. Her grandmothers protested, "Girls don't do that." But her father had decided that it was time for girls to step up and do what boys had been doing for a really long time. He gave her 1 day's notice, and she did it. That girl was at the time a young girl, 12-year-old girl named Judith Kaplan. Some of you have heard of her as Judith Kaplan Eisenstein. She later married, but not when she was 12. That's good, right? Her father, Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan, was not one to simply accept the status quo. He educated his 4 daughters as he would have educated sons. And then he handed his daughter Judith a chumash, a book form of the Torah, and told her that the next day she would read Torah in front of their congregation, in Hebrew and English. That she had the ability to do. And so that Shabbat, at the end of the formal Torah service, Judith Kaplan stood up, chanted the Torah blessings, and read from Torah in Hebrew and English. 70 years later, she recalled, no thunder sounded and no lightning struck. Judith Kaplan had made history in 1922, becoming the first bat mitzvah in the United States. Subsequently, by 1948, about a third of conservative congregations had conducted bat mitzvah ceremonies. In 1955, well, does anyone know where the first Reform congregation was that had bat mitzvah? I learned that this week. Wise Temple in Cincinnati. The number of ceremonies climbed steadily in the 50s, and more than 1/2 of all conservative and more than 1/3 of Reform congregations had implemented bat mitzvah by mid-century. That number seems high to me, but perhaps not. It wasn't here, it wasn't in my home congregations, and I know many of yours. And by the mid-60s, bat mitzvah was a regular feature of conservative congregational life and was growing in Reform. Today, it is a mainstay from Reform to modern Orthodox. Certainly for teens, and as we here at NSCI know very powerfully, it is a powerful journey for adults too. Here, our girls do what our boys do, exactly the same thing, and our adults do basically what our kids do, some more and some less, depending. They say it feels like more sometimes. And so many women who were, and we have an adult program because many women who were not just women, but it's primarily women who were not able to fulfill this milestone as kids are able to do so, and have done so in our adult B'nai Mitzvah program since the year 2000 and before. That's milestone number 1. Milestone number 2. On June 3rd, 1972, 50 years ago, a different unheard of milestone occurred at Plum Street Temple in Cincinnati. Anyone know? Dr. Goodman, you can't answer. Rabbi Geffen? Yes, go ahead, Judy Applebaum.
The first Reform rabbi, female.
Yes, Rabbi Sally Present was ordained in Cincinnati by the Hebrew Union College, thanks to the courage of Rabbi Nelson Glick, the then president of HUC. A decade earlier, a memorable correspondence took place when a young woman from Cleveland wrote that she wished to apply to the rabbinic program. Sally Present wished to become a rabbi. There's a great set of them, at least the official correspondence, not hers, but she's commented on. And the carefully worded responses to this college student opened the door for her to study and didn't say no, but didn't quite say, yes, you can become a rabbi. I said, yeah, come study. And didn't quite invite her in at first. Ultimately, Dr. Glick, who did not live to see her ordained, but that was one of his big goals, very much wanted to ordain women and made this happen. He convinced the Board of Governors of the Hebrew Union College to let her be ordained a rabbi. Sally Present entered the Hebrew Union College as the only woman. Faculty and students alike had to adjust. The men lived in dorms then. They had no place for her to live, among other things. Professors had to change their language. They were used to saying gentlemen, and it changed. And in 1972, Rabbi Sally Priestland was ordained by the Hebrew Union College, the first woman rabbi ordained by a seminary. 4 decades earlier, Rabbi Regina Jonas was actually ordained in Germany in the eve of the war, but she died during the Holocaust. When Rabbi Priestland was ordained, as she tells it, her entire class, all males, stood up in support. She describes that to this day as a powerful act. Yet before she began her career at the Stephen Wise Free Synagogue in New York City, a congregation deeply committed to social justice, she did not have an easy time finding a job. People were not ready or wanting to hire a woman. She was the last member of her class to find a job. And after a successful tenure there, she struggled again, as the congregation first refusing to hire her as their senior rabbi when the then senior rabbi retired. Ultimately, after working some part-time jobs around, and finding congregations who wouldn't even speak to her, she had a fulfilling and amazing career at Monmouth Reformed Congregation in Tinton Falls, New Jersey, serving them and creating community beautifully for 25 years. This year, of course, we mark the 50th anniversary of Rabbi Priestland's ordination, and we note how much the face of the rabbinate has changed. Look at this congregation alone. 3 women rabbis have served NSCI, and three women rabbis and 1 woman cantor, if I did the math right, have grown up here. Milestone number 3. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries in the United States, women began creating organizations that took on societal issues and needs of the day, supporting immigrants, advocating for social reform, moving Jewish education forward, and strengthening the work of synagogues. The women involved were primarily volunteer lay leaders for whom this was really their profession, as well as their passion. Among the organizations created was NFTS, the National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods. On January 21st, 1913, 156 delegates met in Cincinnati to organize the NFTS, the National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods. Carrie O. Simon was chosen to serve as temporary chairwoman and later its first president. Advocacy was a large part of sisterhood's philosophy from its inception. The women were at the forefront of social action and change. They embraced relief efforts during World War I, brought German rabbinical students to the United States, saving their lives in World War II after Hitler shut down Jewish academies of learning, participated in the formation of the United Nations, and spoke out for women's rights. And in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, they took on more amazing causes. They were a primary supporter of the Hebrew Union College, NIFTY, the National Federation of Temple Youth, the Jewish Braille Institute, and generally advanced the cause of Jewish women. Sisterhood, or Women of Reformed Judaism as it's now known, and here the women of NSCI, has evolved and morphed and renamed, yet at the core remains true to those values, to the priorities of advancing the roles of women in Judaism, to the values of supporting Jewish education, charitable pursuits, advocacy for sure, on causes near and dear to our hearts, causes of social justice. And of course, to supporting our camps, our youth, and the education of our clergy. 3 milestones, 2 of them round numbers. We'll take the third all together. Why do I raise them this evening? Not just because it's WNSCI Shabbat, but it's that too. Here we are tonight in a service led by women, by a dozen, if I've got my math right, in a congregation that, as I mentioned, has been served by women rabbis for over 30 years, has had several women student rabbis and cantors, numerous women presidents. We name our baby girls as we name our baby boys. Our B'nai Mitzvah stand together doing the same thing. Of the 12 women who led tonight, I think I got the math right, 11 of them have been bat mitzvah in their lifetime, whether as teens or adults. A number of them here in our program. That's like so obvious to us, but it's not. Because to us, all of this is normal and regular, right? I mean, I have a boy, I have a girl, they did the same thing at their B'nai Mitzvah service. We look at what our kids can do, our adults can do, but we can't take this for granted. None of us in this room witnessed Judith Kaplan. None of us is that old. Many of us can recall perhaps Rabbi Present being ordained or headlines or stories about it. By now, it's normal and regular. When I was ordained 27 years ago, people would continue to come up to me and say, oh, I've never met a woman rabbi, or I've never, right? We've got this for many years. We still get it, but much less, because it's normal, it's regular, but not to be taken for granted. Women's roles in Judaism have transformed over time, particularly in the past century. And we know that in the larger world, women's numbers may equal men's in some fields and surpass in others. We certainly see many, many women studying to be rabbis and cantors. It's no longer an issue for women to apply to be rabbis or cantors, and we don't think twice about having a bat mitzvah, being called to the Torah. But we can't stop there. Bat mitzvah, rabbis, women in Judaism, women leading our communities, the participation in conversation is there. It's ordinary and extraordinary. You know that old ad? I don't really like cigarette ads, but you've come a long way, baby. We've come a long way, but we've got a while to go. There are still unspoken or unconscious assumptions about men and women and how we lead. We still have to consider how anything from learning styles to, in our general society, medical trials, to even how physical structures are built, whether they're built with men in mind or men and women. I sometimes, but much less, still pause before speaking about certain women's issues, thinking it might get labeled as, oh, she's doing that women's stuff again. I've said here before. We must keep moving ahead in these conversations. We must consider realities of implicit bias, economic lack of parity. We must consider rituals that mark the times in men's lives and women's lives, new rituals and traditional ones. And we must, of course, advocate for things in our world which might be looked at as women's issues, like the decisions around a woman's body, but that are decisions for all of us. We must look together as community, have communal responsibility. We've come so far, and yet we need to keep going and growing and changing and learning and acting. So this Shabbat, I invite all of you, however you identify, whatever your gender, consider the women in your lives, whether they're people you knew or people whose names you knew or whose legacy you knew or taught you. Consider the firsts. Who was the first, perhaps, to go to college in your family? Who was the first to come to the United States? Who was the first to go to work? Who was the first in your field? Who was the first to inspire you to learn more than you thought you could, or to reach for a professional goal you never thought you could? Who was the first to challenge you to make a difference in your community? Who was the first to break a barrier, glass or other ceiling? Who was the first to cause you to think differently about who does what in your life? It's not a man's role or a woman's role or anything else. Who were the first who challenged you, who inspired you, and who travel with you? Remember their inspiration. If they're alive, get on the phone this weekend and tell them. Pick up the phone and say, you taught me, you inspired me, you challenged me. And if they're not, go tell someone younger about them. Actually, go tell someone younger about them anyway. Tell them who taught you and why, or what our kids, grandkids, students, employees, mentees, whatever, who they shouldn't take for granted. And together, let's step back with gratitude for those who have shattered ceilings and allowed us to reach this day. Please join me. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehachianu v'kiyamanu v'higianu la'zman hazeh. We praise you, Adonai, our God, sovereign of the universe, who gives us life, sustains us, and has brought us to this day of acknowledging what any of us and all of us can do. Amen. Shalom.